yeah, that's going to be really cool for my players.
We have to put it out, even though it needed 2 more years.
Hyperlinked, Breaker, why should I buy it?
It's got roguelike elements, it's run-based. It's also really stupid to make in a lot of ways.
9 months just to prep for Kickstarter.
I think for us what worked was...
we feel very comfortable showing each other garbage.
Absolute trash.
With every project, you're choosing a different publisher. Are you just trying to try them all?
Whatever like smaller developers can do to plan for...
If this industry is so horrible, like why are we all working in it?
I love making spreadsheets.
I hate spreadsheets.
So what would you recommend for the next year?
Go hibernate.
Hi everyone, my name is Ninel Anderson. I'm CEO of Devoted Studios and I'm your host at Devoted SpeakIndie. Yesterday is a totally different episode. We're going to be interviewing Alx Preston from Heart Machine, and it's going to be a very interesting conversation about how to survive as an indie game developer in the current market. So tune in. You never worked in the gaming industry before starting Heart Machine, so like fully indie. Tell me like a little bit of the story. How did you're like, I'm hanging out with my buddies, playing video games, like we should do a studio.
I mean, I had done a lot of like freelance work before in different entertainment industries and art and whatever else. So yeah, I've never done games specifically, but I have friends, you know, who made indie games, independent developers, working alone or with a couple other people. And I was always interested in making games, but never really knew my path for that. Didn't really want to do AAA because that seems boring or, you know, rough in a lot of ways that I wasn't interested in. And indie stuff seemed compelling, but, you know, even when it was getting started, it seemed really brutal.
Does it still feel brutal or?
Oh, I mean, I think being in games, period, is pretty tough. So I don't think it ever gets easy or is easy by any stretch. But I think knowing enough people that were willing to kind of go alone and strike out and try and do something really daring like that, it kind of gave me some of the motivation to be like, all right, maybe I should try this out.
And so what was the one day where you're like, okay, I'm doing it?
I don't think I had it one day, but I just had like a really rough couple of years health-wise and made some decisions to do things that I only really wanted to do, generally speaking, as I was wasting away and turning into a skeleton. So it made sense to try and actually dig into games for serious, because I had done some stuff like that previously with friends here and there over the years. Always try to do like a little project, start something up, and for game stuff I never really went anywhere with a couple of different friends. And so I was like, well, I should just do this myself / work with somebody else that I can just hire instead of try and do it with a friend, whatever. So that's kind of where that started.
My situation, however, differs from the typical spectrum in complexity, severity, and overall difficulty rating. I'm living in a hardcore mode. I run Heart Machine, my game studio, with a team of 9. This is more than a full-time gig and takes up a major portion of my weekends as well.
I think the culture at Heart Machine is actually just chill and being extremely collaborative and basically being good work partners to each other. It comes from just being like, this is how you build something quickly. We're very good at passing things back and forth.
Yeah.
I feel like I have so much trust in Laura that like sometimes I'll be writing and just be like, oh, I don't know the right thing for this. I don't want to think about it. I'll just leave a note and be like, I don't know, this is bad, but like I need to just move on. Laura, tell me what you think.
It's really good to be able to work on a game story with somebody else who's also been in the biz for a very long time, and we both know exactly what the limitations of our discipline are and what we can get away with and what we can't get away with, and it lets us solve problems really quickly. And it's also good that we feel very comfortable showing each other garbage.
Absolute trash.
That makes it a lot easier to get to something good. You have to share things at the most garbage possible level so that you can iterate on them.
So you had your own little bit of capital that you then hired a few folks to...
I had some savings, some like scraped together savings, basically the last of my cash, and from like freelance work, and decided to ask around if anybody knew Game Maker, because I want to work in Game Maker.
Right.
That's where I met Bo.
That's where you met Bo, because your first game, the Hyperlight Drifter, was done on Game Maker, and now you're doing the Breaker, and that's an Unreal 5, which is like four.
Well, we're using 4. I'm just Unreal generally.
Got it. So, do you feel like starting your first game as an indie developer using like tools like Game Maker is a better way of doing it? Because most of the stuff are pre-done, or like looking back, you're like, oh, I wish we just used an engine and like Unity or something and did it.
No, Game Maker was good for what we did with that game. I mean, every engine has its pros and cons, and Game Maker's no different. It's powerful for 2D stuff, for pixel art stuff. You know, it's got a lot of advantages for those things. That's why people continue to use it still. Unity has a lot of cool stuff in it, but again, pros and cons, and it depends on how good somebody is with the tools. You know, Bo was an expert with Game Maker, so I was like, okay. And I felt like I could jump into that and maybe learn something about it and deal with it in some way, because I wasn't looking to make a 3D game or anything too wild. You know, well, I mean, Drifter ended up being a lot more complicated, but even still, I was like, oh yeah, this seems like a good starter, you know, engine / project for getting into games.
Drifter had the local co-op, right? And this one has a full co-op.
Yeah.
What is that?
Online,
full online.
Yeah.
How many players?
3 players at once. So.
Why did you go with 3?
A lot of different reasons. You know, easier to design for that. And like as soon as you introduce a 4th player, I mean, we could do more players technically, but under the hood is different than, you know, is this going to flow well? How's this going to feel for combat? Is it going to be too crowded, or, you know, we're going to be able to balance things correctly? So
because Mountaintop released Spectre recently, and they're not a roguelike, obviously they're like an FPS, but they released the 3 players, which was like very unusual for the FPS game. So I'm like, okay.
I mean, again, it depends on what type of game you're making, the design of it, but ultimately, you know, the thing that you have to keep in mind with multiplayer is going to be fun at, you know, 1 player, 2 player, 3 player, 4 player, however many players you're doing as well. How
much do you feel like the Drifterers will be able to relate to Breakers? What do you feel?
I feel like, you know, if you like action stuff, if you like Drifter, you liked it for a few different reasons, probably, including, you know, the world that we're building, you know, the types of designs that we do with characters and our art. And so while this like functionally, mechanically might be a very different style of like flow, we're still very much focused on the type of action that we liked to do in Drifter. If you liked the style and vibes of Drifter, then you'll probably like the style and vibes of this too.
Right.
Even though, again, it's not the same, you know, mechanical game in a lot of ways, as far as how you're like flowing through room to room or place to place, you know?
Right. And in terms of the universe and lore, how much is going to be translated?
It's all the same world. Mm-hmm. So it's just different timeline and different parts of the world that you're hanging out in, and so you'll see a lot of those threads kind of come together in different ways, where you might remind yourself of what happened in Drifter and see parts of that story like expanded on. Mm-hmm. So hopefully. I don't know, you told me that you're going to run into a bunch of bugs and stuff, but it plays really smooth. Is it because of me here, or? You here, that's it. I mean, there are
good juju. And what was the moment where you were like, oh, I think there's something in here, and you decided to go to a Kickstarter campaign?
Yeah.
Like,
I kind of wanted to do that, you know, as Bo and I were exploring ideas. You know, he's doing programming, I was trying to learn stuff, and I had a few different prototypes, and then finally got into what became Drifter and decided, like not too shortly after that, but I'll try and do a Kickstarter. You know, it seems like it's going somewhere. It seems like I could finish it out. It seems like there's a completable version of this in some fashion other that like Bo and I could do, and maybe somebody else. And you know, it took like 9 months to put all that together to get the Kickstarter launched from there.
9 months just to prep for Kickstarter launch?
Yeah, putting together the pitch, you know, because I was doing the whole Kickstarter myself. Bo was programming the game, and I was working with, you know, folks on the music side of things, and so it just took a while to. It took a bit of time to like really find our footing on like what the game really was going to be and what kind of pieces we could build to showcase for the trailer and all that stuff. So just it was wanted to make sure the pitch went well because it's the only shot that I felt like I had.
Were you doing some other side jobs while doing the game, or?
No, I was still pretty unhealthy at the time, so any like extra free time I had, I was doing that. I was working with another buddy on like some tabletop stuff that we were kicking around for a little bit too. So trying to figure out like what in games would be most compelling to do. So but that was it. It was just like those couple of projects.
And then you were trying to get like 30 grand from Kickstarter, and you got like what, 600,000, something like that.
Yeah, that was the original goal.
And you were like, was that the feeling?
I mean, to some extent, but also. It's a lot of money, but then very quickly you realize it's not that much money.
Did you realize that because you didn't plan well how much production you need, or like the ambitions and what the player wanted like suddenly like exploded the scope of the game?
Well, I'd planned for different versions, like
Got it.
If it was the $30,000 version, then that's like, like 9 months of development for me and Bo, and maybe like somebody else do some freelance work. And then as it started to grow, I planned for larger scope and scale.
Right.
So that's why I've broken out into different like tiers and all that stuff, and started to like really make it a fuller thing. Since initially, again, at that scale for that like smaller end of things, to hit that goal, it was like, all right, this is my first project. This is the first project that, doesn't need to be super mega huge. It could actually just be a smaller thing. I could figure a lot of stuff out and I could build off of that, but it ended up having enough runways like, I should do actually something, a lot bigger then. And
did you fit that budget?
Yeah, we fit that budget.
Yay! It's probably one game that fit the budget.
We had to make it work, so.
Right. Kickstarter used to be one of the big machines of driving, raising funds for indie development community. Do you feel like in 2024 it's still there? If you were not going as a publisher, for example, right? Would you still go Kickstarter right now?
I mean, crowdfunding is really an amazing tool. It's, what gave me my first opportunity in the industry. And it's different now than 2012, 2013, for sure, where someone like me who hadn't been in games before, didn't really have a name. I had a disaster piece attached to the Kickstarter, so that's great. And Bo, who's known for Samurai Gun and other games that he had done, so I did have some amount there. But even still, it was an unproven group, an unproven collection at the time, and I don't think that happens nearly as much anymore on Kickstarter.
Right. What do you think worked for you guys back then? Like, is what worked for you, is it translatable? Like, whoever is in our audience watching this and they're like, okay, I really need to raise money for this game and I have this, amazing idea. Just like, what are the, 3-4 tips that could work?
The top secrets that doctors don't want you to know.
Exactly.
I think, having people attached to your project that are a known quantity in some way or another, that have a name, that can provide some sort of stability, or trust in it, is certainly helpful. Obviously, if the pitch is good, that helps too.
Right.
If it's something that you think is going to be compelling or is actually compelling for a certain chunk of the market, certain audience, if you know your audience, that's great and you should target that. But ultimately, Kickstarter's changed a lot since 2012, 2013, and what was true then is not really true now. And so, I think for us, what worked was just the right time and place. It was the main factor. It was in an era when pixel art games weren't like saturating the market as much, where you could still do something kind of novel on that front. Where there was a like hunger and desire for the audience for new voices in the space in a way that maybe isn't true now because of just like the sheer quantity of games that come out every day all the time. And Steam was a very different place even, where We had a whole different way to feature games. That was even before they started opening up their marketplace so that anybody could put anything on there. It's like, no, they were very particular about filtering games at that time.
I remember pitching to Steam in 2013 of getting a game onto Steam. I actually got on it, but it was like it was like luck is when opportunity meets the preparation. That was exactly what happened there. So
so I think crowdfunding is still viable and it's still good, but I think it's much more limited to, again, known quantities, and way more known now than it was then. Because again, I was nobody in the games industry back then when I was launching that. Again, Bo was great, he had a name. Rich is great, he had a name, but that it was also me there being like, hey, look at this thing, do you like it? And people were willing to take a chance. But because that bubble burst where too many projects failed, too many projects were scams, too many projects didn't fulfill what everyone fantasized about when they were funding that thing, the sheen wore off of Kickstarter and crowdfunding in general. But it's still viable,
Frost Giant recently raised like $1 million, but which is great. Really thumbs up to them, but they're a team of 50 people in Orange County. How far can it get you in the
$1 million for 50 people? Not very far.
Not very far.
But if you're a team like the Shovel Knight guys, like Yacht Club, and they did Mina on Kickstarter not too long ago, they raised some about 1.3 or 1.4 or something like that. But they're a known quantity. They were on Kickstarter previously. They had a successful project from that. They were able to expand that success and make a really excellent game series. So they're established, and I think established players can go on Kickstarter over and over again still, and that's great. But that doesn't leave much room for folks that are trying to just start off like I was 10 years ago.
So you wouldn't add an addition of Kickstarter to your current games?
I've definitely thought about over the years, would we ever go back to Kickstarter? I think it's possible. Funding situations now in the industry are so radically different than they were a couple of years ago that it's a serious consideration, I think, for any developer or smaller developer these days.
Everything you guys are doing are resonating with the community, and I've came across so much of the fan art. What's your interaction with the community outside of everything that the publishers are doing? Is there something that you're doing specifically to support?
Community building is really important to me, just across the board, not just with Hard Machine stuff, but even Glitch City here in LA. We started that also 10 years ago.
Glitch City?
Yeah, Glitch City. It's a collective out here, a bunch of indie devs, and we just wanted the space to work.
Okay.
And this is where Drifter was made outside of my bedroom. So we've had a really great community, and it's super important for us to keep engaging with them, one way or another. And I've met a few different artists that have made really cool fan art, and over the years, and that's always a lot of fun too, because they just have wonderful things to say, and they're putting passion into something. So they're not doing it for money. They're not doing it for any other reason. It's wow, you're passionate. That's great. And we can talk about this, and that's super fun.
The come from should be from your heart and the desire to connect with the community. But what are the tools that you feel actually with that created biggest exposure or biggest connection with the community? I don't know, Discord, going to Comic-Con, going to Gamescom. Where would you put your energy if you're, for example, doing self-publishing and you don't have a ton of marketing money behind?
Sure. The strategy now is different than it was in 2013, 14, 15. The strategy that I was taking then for Drifter, I wouldn't necessarily suggest employing now for a lot of folks, because there are, just differences in even the platforms. Twitter used to be a really big tool for indie devs back in the day, and it's early in its first 8 years or so. And it still can be a compelling tool, but we know what's happened to Twitter over the years. Yeah. And communities have gotten more private in a lot of ways. And so those larger platforms where everyone is and everyone might see everything, it's more insular. And so, Discord's become a more important aspect of things. Creating and building that community individually is a lot more important now than it was before, where you could have a more open, large platform space. So the Discord or whatever version of that you can get building up individually so that people want to come to it and they can do word of mouth, I think is probably still the best thing you can do.
We see in the news layoffs here, layoffs there. So you see all these big companies being affected, and you're way more plugged in the indie scene. What are you feeling you guys experiencing, and what are your other friends experiencing in the industry?
fucked up shit, like it's not great. There's a lot of stuff that happens on the industry side that isn't really ever telegraphed well or even spoken about in any kind of public manner to the audience, to the actual consumer. And so the games industry is kind of notorious for being very private, very secretive, and for a lot of good reasons, and I think for some bad reasons too.
Right.
Over the history of games, as a person who was a fan of games, still is a fan of games, growing up, like I always wanted to know as much as possible about the industry, and it was difficult, unless you're kind of in it. It's not very transparent. It's a relatively opaque industry to the consumer, to the like public-facing aspect of it. And one silver lining for the past nightmare couple of years is that I think that opacity has been turned up and or down actually. That opacity has been turned down, and now there's a lot more insight into like what the fuck is going on in the industry. It's bad, and it's bad that it kind of took a lot of really negative things for people to start talking about these things publicly, about like how the industry's run, what the core issues are. It's a similar idea. Like, do you remember the EA spouse back in the day?
No.
Like the 2000s and the aughts, where there's a bunch of blog posts about, some EA spouse talking about how her husband or partner, whatever else was, being mistreated in the industry at EA. Like the ridiculous amount of grind and hours that they were doing, that like not commensurate pay, just like the really grueling and life-changing things that the industry was like kind of grinding this like couple into the dust. And that was a big point of topic for a while, and that started to open up channels about like, hey, maybe we should start talking more openly about how this industry kind of discards people, like ruins them and discards them with by abusing their passions, because it happens, it still happens, but that opened up the conversation, right? And we now are in a spot in 2024 where it's like better than ever in a lot of ways. There's still a ton of problems, right? And those things still happen, but people can talk about it. The public knows a lot more about like the grind of the industry and how things are kind of screwed up. And there's been a lot in the past few years about like sexual harassment and things like that too. The inequalities in the industry. That's really bad that that's happening, but it's good that people are talking about it, that it's becoming a more transparent issue. So again, the bad comes with some good, and that hopefully transforms the industry for the positive ultimately. And I think you see that now, where we're talking a lot about all the bad ways that companies have or publishers have invested or overinvested, the response to COVID and the poor hiring practices, maybe the unsustainable version of creation that we've gotten ourselves into. That's been a long time coming. For instance, like 360 era of budgets building and expectations for game selling being kind of ridiculous. I mean, there was that whole running kind of industry joke, or not even like, this is for anybody that followed games too. I mean, I don't know if you remember, for a decade plus, Squaresoft always being like, oh, that game didn't meet our projections. Their game would sell 1 million copies, 10 million copies, and be like, well, didn't meet our projections. And everybody's like, oh, are you kidding me? Like, what? It sold 10 million copies, like Tomb Raider or whatever else.
Right.
Year after year, you'd see like, oh, it didn't meet our expectations. Like, what were your expectations?
Well, the question is like, how much did you spend in marketing?
Well,
and that because that really affects. And was that marketing effective? I mean, I've been a part of bigger corporations as well, and like just sometimes seeing the P&L of like the marketing budget that is absolutely not accountable for anything, and then it's like, well, your game didn't sell well. I'm like, you were advertising it here where there's no of the players that are planned for this game. Like, it's not a core audience and stuff like that. You always want to have something in your pipeline in case something falls through. And do you have like a percentage of your budget that you plan, or a percentage of your team that you're like, 2 people, 10% of your staff is working on new ideas? Is there a number?
No, there's no like specific hard and fast number. It's mostly just like who has some time, who has some interest. If somebody's trying to wrap stuff up on a project and we're at the tail end of shipping, I'm not going to ask them to do things. But I've worked with Sean Ward now, who was our animator on Drifter back in the day, and he's been here the technically the longest now, besides me. And so he's like, original person. Like I'll work with him on some of the pitches sometimes on like an animatic. And he's always doing, a main project that I'll take some time during, some sprint or whatever. I was like, hey, can we like work on these, storyboards together? Can we try some stuff and put it into motion? So I'll do things like that with different folks at different times to start to put those pitches together and prototypes together, but it's very limited and just kind of organic on who's available and what's going on.
Right. I do agree with what you shared. I also feel like it kind of went to the bad talking about the industry is kind of going over the top. Like I can't open my LinkedIn without just like it feels like if this industry is so horrible, like why are we all working in it? And like I feel like it's getting blown out of proportion. I do want to I feel like I on a daily basis just struggle with so many things. And I do want a little bit of the hope when I'm reading my social networks and like the good stuff about other people are doing and stuff like that. But then it's like everything is hard here and then it's more hard here. And I'm like, at this point, I just give up,
I mean, and people have given up, right?
Yeah.
People have left the industry and, for plenty of reasons, plenty of valid reasons. I think when it's a passion-driven industry, right? A lot of people are in it because they love games, and that's relatively unique as far as industry goes. Film is similar in some ways, and TV in a lesser way. Like I have friends who have done, a lot of different entertainment industries, but I think games is particularly unique in the fact that it's so passion-driven, and you see how much that's been kind of used, and not even talking about like publishers, but even personally, it's like you drive yourself to do things that you might not do otherwise because you care so much about this thing and you want to do this thing so much. And it's extraordinarily challenging in a way that, I think making a film or a TV series or making anything is a lot of work, right?
Yeah.
But games, again, are particularly unique because it's all of these creative components combined. It's extraordinarily expensive. It's really difficult to project like how successful something's going to be. And so those metrics are just ambiguous at times, oftentimes. And companies are spending more than ever, and the risks are so huge because it's like one failure and you're just done, like you're wiped out in a way that you might not ever get a chance again. And so when our budgets are ballooning, even on the indie game side of things, like $500K back in the day in 2013 for Drifter, we wouldn't have been able to make that game today, 10 plus years later with that same budget. It just wouldn't have happened. And when you talk about marketing budgets and everything, it's like, we saw that, the court cases and the Sony docs link where they didn't mark the stuff correctly. And it's like, oh yeah, those games, the Guerrilla Games stuff like cost $200+ million. Like these are budgets that are well beyond, like these are Hollywood mega budgets for the biggest titles. And that's like a normal AAA game is hundreds of millions of dollars these days. And that's sometimes not even including marketing, like you're saying, which a marketing budget could be like 50% plus or more sometimes.
Probably like at least double,
right?
Yeah.
Like Destiny 1, it's like $1 billion game ultimately when you include marketing and everything. That game cost almost $1 billion for them to make that damn thing. So it's like...
They also didn't outsource anything. They built everything in Seattle.
Right. There's a lot of process issues, right, that we could talk about for like why it costs that much. But the point is ultimately, it did cost a lot, and games haven't gotten cheaper over time. And so what you're seeing in the industry is a lot of sort of wrestling with that fact of budgets have gotten really big and unsustainable, especially for the larger your project is. Like it's been a problem coming for a decade plus. We've seen this coming where everyone's like, no, games are getting expensive, and Unreal 3 and then 4 and then 5. Like, Gears of War each year was getting more expensive. Epic saw that coming. They sold that title, that series to Microsoft because they're like, we can't make this anymore after Gears 3. They're like, this was great. It was a huge success. It's like a clear franchise that's like holding up Xbox with Halo and other stuff like that.
Right.
And even they're like, nah, we're out. Like this is just way too expensive now.
Well, that was a good move for them.
Yeah, then smart, but they saw it coming.
Yeah.
And a lot of the industry didn't adjust similarly. in AAA. Again, that's why this is a problem that's been coming for a long time, since the beginning days of AAA, when it became really expensive to make it at this fidelity, and it's just getting more, it's not getting cheaper.
It seems like with every project you're building, you're choosing a different publisher. Are you just trying to try them all? Annapurna, Gearbox, Arc, Devolver, and also considering that you signed with Perfect World, then Gearbox Publishing, then it becomes Arc. Three different ones, right?
I think it makes sense to work with different partners on different projects. That's the simple version of it, you know. Same thing as trying to diversify on the projects we do, diversifying with the different partners we work with, so that there's more opportunities in the future, so that, you know, they're not putting all their eggs in one basket. So if you had multiple projects, going like one publisher on two things is a harder sell in a lot of ways, / there's more risk involved with that. So, and I just like working with different groups and seeing how things work. And I think tailoring that to the project itself, like Devolver is a good partner for Possessors, you know, they know what they're doing with their marketing, their style kind of fits with this in a really good way. So it made sense for them. And I think Breaker made a lot of sense for, you know, what we're trying to do with that, with Perfect World / Arc now. So I think what the project is, and then having somebody or a group that matches that is important too.
Right. I mean, one would probably argue that you can also have a bidding war if you have multiple offers on the table.
Back in the day, you know, but these days it's a different story on what's available out there, right? So, you know, the decision for working with certain partners too, even if there is different offers on the table, comes down to who do we think is going to be the most supportive to work with. And, you know, all the publishers we worked with so far have been that, so that's been great. We're in an interesting spot at Heart Machine because we're not really indie in that way anymore, because we have 50 plus people working on a few different projects, and that's great. So we are at this kind of mid-scale or ambiguous gray area between like indie and AAA, and it's kind of a no man's land at this point, and it's tough to navigate because it's like, well, you know, you have to still have reconcilable budgets, but you need certain levels of talent. They expect certain things that are like more AAA, but you have a mentality that's still more indie. And so you're still trying, there's not a lot of groups out there that try and operate in this scale, because it's a really challenge. I mean, all scales are challenging, but it's a little more straightforward when you have like a mega platform backing you on the AAA side of things to some extent, or it's a little more straightforward when you're just one person or a handful of people. When you get into this kind of mid-range, and this is part of why, like, you know, you think about something like Double Fine, for example. Like, they were that scale for a long time, and part of why they sold was to have comfort and to not have to think about the finances of it anymore. Because I mean,
I'm sure they still think about the finances, because when they provide.
But Tim spoke about it very openly when they sold to Microsoft, and talked about it very publicly. And it's that same mentality of like, it's really tough to exist in the games industry, period, no matter your scale. But when you get into these gray areas where you're not quite this, you're not quite that, and you know, projects are like of a certain budget and expectation that maybe isn't the norm, that's where it gets even more gray.
What's the gray area budget? So
projects that I think today that can still get funded, you know, if you've got something that's under 500K and you're an indie title and maybe you're in quantity, like you can still get funded for that from different publishers.
Under 500?
Under 500K.
Okay.
Maybe in the like $2 million range for, you know, some like slightly larger team, maybe around like the 3, 4, or 5 mark if you're particularly known. And then after that, there's nothing for $50 million probably. You know, like you're not going to see really much at 10, 20, 30, 40. You know, you have to start to get into AAA territory, and that's going to probably be like $60+ million you're talking about, because the ROI just doesn't make sense at a certain point. You need to charge a certain amount because the market's really price sensitive. You know, just it is, and it always has been. You put a game out there for $6, you put a game out there for, you know, $19.99. There's brackets that we hit, and you just like can't hit certain things because there's an expectation. If you're $39.99 game, that's a particularly weird spot. People understand, you know, a $60, $70 game, they know it's AAA, there's an expectation for that, right? And then everything else is basically $20 and below is mostly what the market is. Anything between that, rarity. You know, it's like, oh, you can look at something like, what was it? Remnant 2 that came out earlier this year, and they sold millions of copies. They did really well. One of the few like $40 games, like you just don't see those a lot because that's that like mid-tier, again, kind of ambiguous gray area where it's like, that's not a $5 million budget.
But it's the same publisher that you guys are signed with, the Hyperlight Breaker.
Yeah, it used to be Perfect World, then became Gearbox SF, and now is Art Games owned by Embracer. So, but they are one of the very few publishers that still want to do titles of that kind of tier of like, it's not AAA, but it's not indie really. It's kind of this like B tier.
Would you call it AA?
AA-ish? AA-ish. It's
so help me understand. And again, for the audience, and I'm sure you've talked to millions of publishers. Well, there's probably like, why would it say millions?
346 different publishers or something like that. In the world.
Is it 300?
It's in the hundreds.
Okay, because I know like maybe like a couple handfuls.
There's a lot that sprung up in the past couple of years that are smaller publishers.
Okay, well, there's Hooded Horse, the Raw Fury, a bunch of folks that are probably under the $2 million budget range, right?
Yeah,
that's where they play.
So like, as far as the like B tier AA, there's not a good label for it either. That's why I say gray area, because you can call it a couple of things, but it's not exactly that either. Like AAA is kind of understood what that is. Again,
there's Annapurna, that's everything.
Annapurna that recently had some big issues, was one of the few publishers out there that was doing this scale of like, hey,
and successfully.
Very successfully. They made a lot of money over the past 6 or so years.
For who doesn't know, like the entire staff quit. A bunch of friends of mine, which is like ridiculous.
Friends of mine too.
You guys worked with Annapurna, right? On Solar Ash, yeah.
Which, it's a good game. Had a good experience with that final. We were one of the early games to sign with them when they were first starting up. And I knew Gary and folks like that. I was like, hey, this seems cool. Let's do this. And they're willing to put out some cash for us and be like, sounds great. Let's get into 3D. But I mean, that's a different subject. But yes, they were one of the few that's at this kind of gray area. Like they would do smaller projects, but they would go up to a certain budget level that a lot of groups now just won't even hit anymore.
Both of you guys worked on Solar Ash, or when did you join?
I worked on Solar Ash originally as a systems engineer and then as a writer. Solar Ash went through a couple different phases, and we unfortunately, our writer left at one point, and then we went through a couple different other writers. And then I was implementing a lot of the narrative systems of the game. And then as a result was very familiar with the narrative and with the original script. So eventually I was approached by a producer and they were just like, how would you feel about being the writer? And I said, that sounds awesome. Previously, I have worked in animation and comics as a writer. So like this wasn't coming out of like nowhere.
Is every writer at Heart Machine is required to be also an engineer?
No, I'm just a career narrative person. Tyler brought me here to help him out and do editorial on you.
Which you're fantastic at.
The big portion of the Solar Ash team actually moved to Possessors.
Yeah, a bunch of people did. People have come and gone. But yeah, it was cool because a lot of the kind of core people that I had worked with directly the most on Solar came over, and so we had like a really good kind of little core team of people who know each other and work well together. When you're working on a new project, it's really nice to not have to like have a new team built from scratch because like people who I know who I've worked with for years already, I can just say things and they'll know what I mean, and I don't have to like, bring people on board with the vision as much. And so it's nice when you have everybody, working well together like that, who know each other and are comfortable, and there's not like awkward communication.
So if you're first time in the studio, you would recommend to go to build a game that is under $2 million?
Absolutely.
And to do that, you need to.
As you can.
And to do that, you need to plan for a game that is $1 million. Then you're probably going to balloon your budget and have like for
always plan to go over. Always plan a contingency, because it's my experience, not with just our games, but friends who have are in games all over the place, whether they run studios or, more focused positions, whatever it may be. Budgets always go over, time always goes over. It's just the impossibility of making games makes that true.
Right.
It's very rare that you see a game that like comes out on time, and even if it comes out on time, I almost guarantee it's been delayed internally before they even announce things.
And you guys plan to have the early access of the Hyper Light Breaker in 2023, and then you pushed it into 2024, and now just a little bit into 5.
A little creeping it.
And on top of that, you had to deal with, Perfect World being sold to Gearbox, then being sold, all these things go down, and now Arc. Like, how did you navigate timeline extensions, budget extensions? And I am honestly asking for, an advice that is applicable for the community, because I feel like a lot of us run into that place, like, what works for you? Like crying, threatening, like
a lot of honest and blunt conversations, really, is what it comes down to. I think Arc Games now, I chose them early on contractually because we were talking with the publisher shopping breaker around. I went with them because, I'd gotten a good sense that they actually give a shit about the games that they're making. They want to make this brand for themselves. They want to elevate it further. Because if you recall, like Perfect World was not really a known brand. It was more, they did a lot of like...
It was built in Korea.
It was like more mobile MMO
yeah.
So yeah, it was more known in the Asian market.
I didn't even know they were publishing, those...
Yeah, and then they picked up Torchlight at a certain point, and then some... So it's like they had done things, but they wanted to be more like an Annapurna in some way, and be like known for like a particular set of games or experiences that you could identify and like, associate with the brand. And so knowing that, I was like, oh, it seems like they actually, they would care about seeing this through and putting good products out. I mean, not like anybody doesn't want to put a good game out, but they would probably want to go the extra mile, and that's the important factor in there. And so they have, it's a challenge when you're still hitched to like some mega conglomerate or, a different entity like Embracer or whatever else, because a lot of publishers there's plenty of publishers that are like owned by somebody larger, or if they're not, then, they have their own limitations there.
But there's Coffee Stain in that group. They're also like the goat simulators and all of that stuff. I feel like they speak indie pretty well.
It's an interesting group is what I'll say. Like they put a lot of things together over the past years, right? And so, especially with like the stack of different talent and people just across the board, because again, like there's a lot of groups that were folded into that, and a lot of really good studios, a lot of good people, publishers, whatever else. So it's an interesting mix is what I'll say that you don't really see elsewhere.
Right.
But that also can make it more complicated to know like how to navigate that stuff.
So what worked for you? Like you came in and you're like, we're not hitting the deadlines. I need 6 more months and more money. And they're like, no. And you're like, yes. And they're like, okay. And then how did it go?
Unfortunately, there's no like roadmap for that, depending on who the developer is, who the publisher is. One party might be falling behind on somewhere or another. Maybe the publisher just wants to get something out the door because they don't have any choices, otherwise there is no more money for them, or they've got things tied up, or they can't release it later because they have a bunch of other games scheduled.
Like Cyberpunk. Yeah,
like Cyberpunk. It's like, hey, we put all this money in marketing, we made all these deals, like we have to put it out, even though it needed like 2 more years actually before it was truly
like
done.
6 months into it, but like with all the patches, I feel like it was a much better space than it was.
It was better, but it took more than a year to actually get to the point where it was the complete version of that game. And so even still, it's a weird marketplace. So you could release stuff earlier, and it could be not so finished, which happens plenty of times too. And I don't think anybody sets out to want that to happen. Developers definitely don't, and publishers, they want to put something out that makes money. But again, there's all sorts of factors that make it complicated. Unfortunately, like the very lawyer answer is like, it's complicated. And if you've got a good game that the publisher believes in, then sure, there's ways to maybe extend that out and have those hard conversations. There's negotiations we haven't seen about contracts and what that means for payments and rev share and all that stuff. Or, more often than not, what ends up happening is games get canceled. There's a lot of titles out there that never see the light of day, that were never spoken about, that get shuttered after a year, 2 years even.
Well, how do you protect yourself from that? Because a part of that tough conversation is if you open that Pandora box, you might get canceled.
Sure.
Like, what strategies, like what worked for you?
Planning, as much planning as possible. That's just kind of the ultimate answer to all that stuff is you plan for all sorts of contingencies. You make sure you have as much clarity as you can on the project you're trying to make so that you know what it is as much as you can. But it's scary because it's games and there's so much risk involved with it, because you oftentimes don't really fully know if the game's going to even be good or not until the last mile for so many games, right? There's plenty of games that can start out and be good already, the prototype phase is cool. But there's so many games. I mean, you hear about this all the time. Like, we didn't even know if it was fun until like 6 months before we shipped or whatever else, or like several months before. And that can happen just as often, if not more often, than like the game is always good. So it's such a wild variability on like the risk reward of games that it's just, again, the lawyer is just like, it's so complicated. But again, the best thing that I know how to do these days, and even learning a lot of lessons from Breaker and what we did there, it's like, again, plan as much as we can, make as many contingencies as you can, set yourself up for rainy days and safety nets, whatever that means to you. And also try and de-scope as much as possible beforehand. It's tough because you don't want to say like, make safer projects, right? You want like creative ideas to get out there, especially from smaller groups. That's the agility. That's the advantage of it, is like you can do crazy shit oftentimes, and that's what's going to make a splash more often than not, because we know how much like AAA design has stagnated over the past decade, and that's a big complaint, right? But they do that because it's such a massive risk. And so you're going to see a new Star Wars Outlaw Ubisoft game that's the same Ubisoft game they've been making in a lot of ways, like a lot of the same pillars, because that game costs many tens and hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever else. So
didn't like EA last year decide that they're not going to do licensed games anymore because they can't make the P&L work?
I think they made some internal decisions like that, but EA's, just like a lot of the bigger publishers, have been going through a lot of twists and turns in the past 2 years and making different decisions. Like they've had their third-party ventures that have done pretty well for them, but they kind of contracted on that, even though it was doing well, because, I don't know, accountants were like, too risky.
Yeah.
And Ubisoft, we were just hearing news recently, right, about, Star Wars stuff and how many copies, and like X-Defiant, and like they delayed the new Assassin's Creed. It's like, well, yeah, they have 20,000 employees. They're one of the biggest publishers on the planet. Like EA's got like, what, 10K? Sony's got like 10K. Like, they're huge. And so their projects span continents, and it's thousands of people making these games. That Star Wars game, it's hundreds, if not thousands of people participating. And the human cost alone, like, that $100 million plus budget, like a lot of that is people. Yeah. Because it's so expensive to do. And so whatever you can do, whatever I can do, whatever like smaller developers can do to plan for smaller budgets, to plan for more agility in your development process and build some flexibility and caution into that, even especially if you're going to go for some wild, crazy idea of like, I'm going to make a game about racing cars, but the car is a banana and I'm skating on the moon or something like that. It's like, all right, we'll make sure that, you have a really good prototype and a very small budget to start, and that you're pretty sure that this is going to work in some way or another. Whenever I'm playing and talking, it's one of the harder things to do.
All the levels are procedurally generated, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you don't know how the level is going to look like?
No, not really.
How do you QA it? Isn't every level unique when it's procedurally generated, right? Yeah. So your QA team can play it, but then they might not never ever play that level again, so they might not discover those bugs.
They won't play that level ever again. But we can test certain levels that we make sure that we can replicate. And, there are a lot of like systems behind a procedural game. Okay. So if this level is doing something weird for some reason, like the geometry or, the spawning of different enemies or objects, then we can at least investigate, like, why did that seed behave this way? Okay. And hopefully the systems, the more we work on them, the more specifically tuned against those types of problems they get. so they don't replicate those problems again.
And that sounds like an amazing thing for Twitch, right? Because sometimes people watch the game and they're like, well, I feel like I played this level because I watched somebody else playing it. But in this case, nobody can ever play the same.
Doing the same thing.
So all of the stuff is procedurally generated, or like there's some specific layouts that are there, just like the certain parts and certain objects are being randomized.
There are aspects of it that we handcraft. You know, like that's part of what I wanted to make sure that we did. Was, you know, we have, at least the studio, I mean, I guess tradition is a word, our history of like pretty solid level design. And so there are elements of handcrafted pieces that we kind of stitch together in different fashions in the procedural generation. So it's not like we're never taking a hand to that stuff, you know?
Right.
But
And,
then that's layered in a procedural way and kind of stitched together in a procedural way. So
but there's still layout within which it plays, right?
yeah, there's still like very particular parts of the level that we like, maybe this little fortress or this interior for a building, or but even some of those end up having procedural elements themselves and layered within those handcrafted pieces. So
how does that affect the gameplay? Is it like more, and again, this is me, you know, I've seen the trailer and I've seen a little bit on what is on internet, but again, obviously haven't played the game myself. So like, how does that affect my gameplay? Is that more spaces to hide? Is certain setup of a level more advantageous? Like, what's the idea behind that?
I mean, the idea behind it is you'll have to discover like what that level is and what parts of it, you know, are going to feed different parts of like your build or how you want to achieve the end goal, which is to like kill the bosses in it. So it keeps it interesting every run. That's always the goal for like run-based game, right? Is you might have the same goals for each run, like get to kill the bosses for a lot of roguelikes, right?
Right.
But how you get there is going to change every time. What type of build you have, and you know where you go first or second or third is hopefully going to be different enough each time that you feel like you need to take a unique approach for each run.
So there's no such a thing as like this level is more advantageous for you. They're kind of all the same level of complexity.
It'll depend, and you have to discover in a run like what's going to be good enough for you.
Intrigue. Love that. Do you guys use Houdini or like what?
We do use Houdini. Houdini's a really powerful tool. That's how we create our landscape meshes and, you know, stuff that I'm crawling around on.
Right.
And then on top of that, we have a bunch of systems to like layer things and make sure that it's decked appropriately and getting all the different things. It's just like a mesh at the start. So
has it been hard to find Houdini talent?
I mean, yeah, but we also kind of developed internally. So I think part of, you know, indie games, or at least this mentality of this type of studio, is we're always willing to learn and fail and be bad at things until we're not bad at them anymore. And so even if we don't know a program or don't really know how this is going to work in some way or another for even a design, it's the idea that, well, don't be too afraid of that. Like if we screw up, we screw up. If we can't do it, then we'll try something else, you know?
As long as Alx can remain super powerful and renegotiating deadlines and delivery dates.
Right. As long as I can buy time and budget to like make these things true, then I'm willing to try some weird stuff out.
What would you like not do? Or like, what would you absolutely do like when you're planning a new project?
It takes a little bit of practice, you know, to get more realistic about what things might cost what, and including how many people you think you'll need on the team, what type of coverage you'll need to have for certain ideas. I think there's a lot of trappings with grand ideas or cool things that you want to do in a game. And I think it's important to ask yourself, and I am doing this a lot more on future projects, and even for Possessors, which is a smaller project of ours, you know, working with Devolver on, asking yourself, like, is this feature or design or idea going to be worth it?
Yeah.
Is it going to give me the return on the investment that it's going to take financially, like, budget-wise, to like put, you know, this, I don't know, this like gas feature into my banana that I wanted to have? Could I have the game without the gas feature and it'd be fine, or just as good, or like 80% as good? those are really important questions to ask early on. Like, is it going to be worth it to do this thing that I think might be good? How much is it going to be?
Is there a type of a person that you need on your team to, like, if you're building, you're like a 5 people indie team, like who do you absolutely need to have on your team to make sure you fit the budget?
I mean, that's going to be on a per project and per team type of basis, but there are definitely baselines of obviously need somebody to program things, right? Somebody who's good in that way. Somebody who's got some art chops in whatever style you're going for. Somebody who is going to be good at communicating across a team, whether bigger or smaller. Not necessarily a producer, because you can wear a couple of different hats as a smaller crew. I think the trick that I've learned to managing teams as somebody who's been running businesses for 20 plus years now, when you hit like about a dozen people is when you really need a producer, like a dedicated producer. But under that threshold, generally speaking, if you've got good communication, like you can manage without a dedicated producer. But you have
Even remote?
Yeah, but you got to self-produce. You got to have people that are motivated to do that.
Okay.
And, you know, like Drifter didn't have a dedicated producer. We're all kind of producing, like I was producing a lot. Daddy and Casey, but like we're all kind of making sure that we're just talking a lot, and it's more manageable. 5, 6, 7, 9 people maybe. It starts to get unwieldy, but yeah.
Where is something? Where did we put the document?
I mean, where did you organize anything? Did anybody talk to this person about this stuff today? You know, like there's a lot of managerial stuff that has to happen because you just have more overhead. So keeping a team under that like dozen size is probably a good idea too. Like, what do we think 10 people can get done? Yeah, it was there was this video that like interview from the CEO of Jira, and they had their product that was similar to Slack. I don't even exactly. No, it was like Atlassian, right?
Anything Atlassian is not created to make it.
It's all
to like
bad stuff.
No, it's not a bad stuff. It's just like it requires a lot of to nav. But he was saying that one of the key learnings that they had was that the team that is 12 people can be under 12 people can be self-regulated. If you scale a team from 12 to 24, you usually don't double your output. You usually just get the same output because the amount of rituals and the amount of things that you need to do in order to keep everybody like cohesive. So like if you want to double the output, you need to at least have 36 people on a team. And I'm like, or how can you develop it? It was under 12. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the hard lesson that a lot of people have learned over the past couple of really gnarly years. And it's going to continue to be not great in the industry for some time going forward. You know, people think it's finally over or whatever else. Like, I haven't heard of layoffs in a couple of months. Like, it's still going through changes, a lot of really heavy changes, and it will continue to, because it's a number of problems and that are coming to roost all in like one vector over the past couple of years. And part of that is like course correction on budgets, because, you know, COVID stuff, because of AAA, because there was like basically free money when, you know, interest rates were really low. And so a lot of these things have changed. Or non-existent. Like you could get, Again, borrowing money is basically free. So it's like, why not throw money at problems? And that's not really the case anymore. So it's just, there's a lot of different variables that go into like why we did that this way over the past couple of years in this industry, but it's not over. And there's still going to be pain and problems and adjustments across the board for the next couple of years to come. Do you guys have a good system in place? Like, what helps you write a good narrative?
Spreadsheets are the most important thing about writing a good narrative.
I think a big part of it is spreadsheets, because they help combat the growing amount of narrative that exists.
Well, in video games, everything needs to go into a spreadsheet. And I love making spreadsheets.
I hate spreadsheets to my core.
Making spreadsheets makes me feel good. The thing about video games and about like every single discipline in video games is that you end up with a lot of really small decisions to make, right? All over the game, we have to make a very large amount of very small decisions about how the story fits together, how the story is realized, what assets we will use in order to realize any given moment in the story. Will we carry the moment primarily with text or with audio or with visuals? And so you do need to like have a place to record all those decisions, right? And the spreadsheet is the best place to do it. And creating something like a column in the spreadsheet that's like, make this decision. You can just go down and make that decision about every scene, and it lets you think about the story in a systematic way. Yeah, which is hard to do.
It's hard to do, I think, just because game stories grow so large, especially when you realize you have to try and make a story to fit to a certain amount of space, and continually compartmentalizing your story bits into things that can easily be like chopped up and spread around. I think like there's just no easy way to do that other than kind of spreadsheeting things and giving you the ability to like drag and drop parts into different areas and figure out where your story is going to fit.
Like, what kind of realities did you as a CEO had to deal with over the past year and a half?
I mean, we're not in our own like permanent special bubble on this stuff either. You know, we have some protections in the way that we exist, and just the opportunities are so different now, or so much fewer now, that like ways of funding even smaller projects are much different now. So it's just, it affects everybody at every scale. Even if you don't feel it directly, there's a cascading effect, and there's like pressure and knock-on effects that happen to all scales of studios these days.
So would you recommend for the next year?
Go hibernate.
Go hibernate?
No.
Really?
Kinda. It's a, like, in serious note, I think this like 2024 in particular has been a year of a lot of no's for folks, and a lot of like get fucked types of things, just like really bad situations. I think 25 we'll see some return to some amount of normalcy when it comes to like getting new projects off the ground, because you're going to see publishers being hungrier to stop saying no because they realize we're not going to have projects in a little while. But again, it's still going to be pretty limited. It's not going to be like it was a couple of years ago. And so I hang on for a little bit.
But what is normalcy, right? Because we had, up until 2020, we had pretty much publishers as a single source of like, and a little bit of Kickstarter campaigns and like friends and family, like pulling together the money for building the video games. And then 2020, pandemic, blah, blah, blah. All the money all of a sudden poured. All the VCs that would never give money to video game companies would pour the money in. Mergers and acquisitions, salaries doubled, tripled in the industry. So that for $10 million now you barely can do like a first playable for, a double A-ish plus project. And so when you're saying we might be returning to a normalcy, what is the normalcy? Are we 2020 normalcy?
No, what I mean by that, when I say
like a 2019 normalcy?
No year. Just when I say some amount of normalcy, I mean projects having yeses again.
Okay.
That's it.
But from publishers and VCs, or from mostly anybody, publishers?
From anybody. Because again, like this last year in particular, just a lot of walls went up and like, nope, we're not doing any projects until like fiscal year next year, basically. So that's what I mean by 25. You'll start to see, we might start to see it internally, like audience facing, you're not going to see much of this, but I think there'll be yeses to pitches again in ways that there just hasn't been for like a year.
Do you see some trends of things that are getting more yeses than other things right now?
Here and there. It's starting to open back up, basically, again.
Is there any types of games that you're feeling like the industry is more reactive to right now? Both player part and the publisher part.
On the like audience side, right, you see things still coming out on Steam that do well. There's always like strategy and tactics stuff like that hardcore audience is there in big droves, and that's a safe space. If you're like a smaller developer doing some like turn-based or even real-time strategy thing, is probably a good bet if you like those types of games. They always do well. They have never not done well. When you start to get into like more action-based stuff, that's the riskier thing, because action is so much more about like game feel and ways that like stacking spreadsheets and numbers isn't quite like it's kind of like tabletop games, where there's a tactility to it, and it's like a lot of logic and like the manageable design systems that don't need certain amounts of interactivity. And so when you start to get into more highly interactive games that aren't just like menus, when you get into like platforming or third-person action, that's when it starts to get really risky, because it's really hard to make those types of games. Like the hardest type of game you can make is a third-person action game, basically. Even I remember there's something about like the Respawn group, where they've done a lot of first-person stuff for a long time. Their history, even before that, Call of Duty and all that stuff. And then when they're making the Jedi series, internally there were groups, the people there remarking on like, wow, I never knew how hard it was to make that type of game compared to like what they do in first person. You know, it's like order of magnitude more difficult in some ways. I mean, all games are hard to make, and they've made like really, Respawn in particular has made like really big, ambitious, crazy first person games. But it's just, maybe if you're a smaller group, don't try and make like a 3 Souls-like right out the gate. You know, that's a really tough genre to make, let alone crack, because it's a very specific type of game that people are drawn to. Unless you're like what was that crab game with another Crab's Treasure that did pretty well. They made a big pun here, made a big splash for an indie game. But another Crab's Treasure came out earlier, small game, you know, from the development side of things, budget side of things, but did really well. And it's a Souls-like, but it's a really charming / kind of unique take on that, where it's not just trying to clone that, because it's more platformy, it's more cartoony, it's you know, like the controls aren't trying to just
more welcoming.
It's more, but it's not trying to just like mimic Dark Souls or whatever. It's trying to like take inspiration from and do something kind of wacky and interesting and like more platformy from PS2 era type of stuff.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, if you want to do a third person thing, like do something more like what they did. It's like more fun or more your own take and not just more Dark Souls stuff. So I think that genre is also really saturated.
Yep.
And publishers don't really want to hear about your Souls clone anymore. Like that, those are projects that are
Do not do Souls.
I mean, no, seriously, like you're gonna have a hard time pitching that. Like, here's my version of Dark Souls. Here's my version of Elden Ring. It's not an easy thing.
And it's how much is that? $100 million?
For a project like that?
Yeah.
For which one?
For the Elden Ring.
Oh gosh, I mean, I don't know how much, because Japanese developers, right, from software, they're not that big of a company. I mean, they've grown for sure over the years, but it's not like a Guerrilla Games or like an Insomniac by any stretch when it comes to just like the amount of money they spend on projects. So I don't know how much the budget was, but I doubt it ain't 200 million, you know, I would think.
Google that.
And Bandai Namco isn't that big of a company either, so they're just like spending ad dollars on it. Like they can't spend Sony money. So.
Right.
But they also don't have to, because they have their built-in audience. And From Software's built a really hardcore community that will fall under whatever game that they will make.
Like Kojima?
Like Kojima, yeah.
It doesn't matter what you release.
Doesn't matter what he makes, people will buy it.
Although it does matter.
I mean, it absolutely matters in a lot of ways, but as far as like, can he sell games? Like he could make whatever and it'll probably sell all right, you know? And he could probably pitch whatever, but that's like the position he's elevated himself into, and others have elevated him into over the years, where it's like he's one of those unique few that can just say like, I want to make this, and then somebody will give him a $30 million check or whatever.
Probably more.
Oh,
no.
I'm saying like he could do whatever
Yeah.
at this point on the game side of things, but that's like a handful of people can do that in the industry, if that, basically.
Yeah.
Like Miyamoto left Nintendo, he could go like do whatever the heck he wanted. There's not a lot of people out there, individuals out there, even studios, that could just say, hey, you want to do this thing and we just want to do this, and then get a bunch of money for it. It's tough. And that's the other reality too, is even seasoned studios that have a lot of value currently, it's been very challenging to get yeses to things on any scale, whatever, because again, this retraction in the industry. You know, lessons I learned on Solar Ash and on Breaker was try to be as little of a choke point as possible. And that means establishing solid creative foundation, but then letting people take those reins a lot more and work within those boundaries. Breaker was, I think, the last project that I want to do like that, where I was so much of a linchpin on the day-to-day. Possessors is a lot more like people can take these things and run with them, and I don't have to be there all the time for all the different
But
meetings.
why did you have a desire to build Possessors? Like, what was you're like, I need another game.
Yeah, was doing that. No, I wanted to do something smaller. I wanted to test like our capacity for ranges. I wanted to have multiple projects, because I think that's a lot safer to kind of diversify even on development. I mean, every developer's got a million ideas for games, right? That's the kind of the simplest part, is what's your cool idea? So it's like, yeah, no, I had what I thought was interesting for a new world and a new framework for what we wanted to do. And I also wanted to go back to something that was 2D, at least in perspective. Because doing like full freeform camera stuff is very different, and a lot of different work and a lot of extra work on top of it. So like, okay, can we do a more focused game? Can we have a more focused project that's more, fully understood from the start, and instead of as experimental as Breaker's been?
And were you like, in the kitchen talking to your team, like, hey, I have this idea, and everyone was like, yeah, let's do that? What was the turning point between there was something in your head and like a fuck yeah for everybody to start doing it?
Well, there's a couple of things. Luke, who's the first one technically on this project with me, and I started prototyping very early and just trying a few things. But I usually try and put a pitch together. Even before showing the team something, like have a good presentation with fun slides, evocative things. Usually I'll try and draw a bunch of stuff for it to make sure it's clear, like what we're trying to do, have some comparisons. So, put together the pitch and then tell the team like, hey, this is what, I think we should be doing next. But also there's a judgment call on who do we have at the studio? What's the talent that we have? What would we need to complete this game also? And at least for this game, we have a lot of folks from Solar Ash that maybe didn't really fit in on Breaker in the same way.
Got it.
Because, there's a lot of like linear level design in this game, as one example, where in Breaker, it's open world, it's procedural, so that kind of like focused level design don't quite need it in that way. So in this game, definitely needs that stuff. So a lot of those skills carry over from what we're doing.
So the talent that you had also influenced the idea that you decided to move forward with?
Making sure. And again, like the scope of this is smaller than Breaker and Mini in pretty much every aspect. And wanting to have that balance between, bigger and smaller project in the studio and retaining folks who really enjoy working with and want to keep them on for as long as possible. So we need to like feed new projects, and
that's good leadership.
Trying, it's not easy to do in the industry. It's notorious for turnover, right? Even before all the layoff stuff, it was like, oh, you're done with the project, see you later. It's like, I never loved that idea because there's so much that goes with that person every time, not just the knowledge base and whatever else, but the relationships they built up, with everyone here. And, there's just many aspects of turnover that I never didn't appeal to me. So we do our best to retain folks. And that means having a couple of projects at once, at least, to make sure that we can support what they're doing. Because not every project is going to be exactly the same. Not every project is going to fulfill every role,
Right.
We're not like a huge team on Possessors, so there's a lot of overlap between the two, because we don't have that many environment artists, we don't have that many level designers, so we're doing some of the set decorating ourselves. Right. They're doing asset creation and they're set decking things too, but that's a big job that requires a lot. And so I think that's a really good thing that we're doing, is that I've worked on projects before where there was a more rigid divide between level designers and environment artists, to where there's periods where one group is doing very little and another group is like really crushed with work, and then vice versa. Whereas if there's more overlap, you can help each other and take the workload off and balance it more evenly, which I think is super, super good.
Do you feel like all your skills from Solar Ash as a level designer translatable to what you guys doing on Possessors, or you had to like pick up some tutorials on YouTube?
Well, kind of, in that because Solar Ash they're both platformers. Solar Ash was a 3D platformer. Possessors is a like 3D 2D platformer. Like our visuals are 3D, but gameplay wise it is like a side scroller.
Right.
And so I had never before Possessors worked on a 2D game. So I had never done any 2D level design. And so when it came to like starting Possessors, I had to translate my 3D design knowledge into doing 2D stuff, which is very different. And so, the research was really just a lot of like, playing other games.
Prince of Persia?
Yeah, a lot of Prince of Persia, a lot of other stuff. Yeah.
And when you get a yes for the studio, and I hope this would be helpful for the audience, is there anything that you're trying to negotiate into a contract whenever, is there specific things that are always there for you?
Negotiations are tough too. If you have some amount of leverage, meaning like you're in a quantity, you're a studio with some history, successes, whatever else, then you can start to do negotiations. But oftentimes smaller developers that are just starting out don't have much room to negotiate.
It could happen that the game gets canceled.
Sure.
Do you normally have the rights reversion in the agreement where if they cancel and they don't want to publish you, their rights revert to you and you can still, but like, do they recoup the money that they invested in this case? Or like, how do you negotiate that? Like,
You want to get into contract details, happy to do it. I mean, specifically on that point, there are contracts where like, yeah, if the publisher canceled, you know, you could take it to somebody else if you wanted to. But usually, right, you have to recoup whatever dollars that the publisher spent. That's a rare situation that can happen. Oftentimes what happens with games though is, again, they just get canceled and you never see the light of day because, you know, the publisher will never recoup that. And there's usually not another party willing to fund that unless the game was good and got canceled for other strange reasons because like the publisher went out of business or ran out of money in their end, whatever else. IP rights, usually most publishers don't ask for that anymore. That used to be a thing for a long time where it's like, we own this property and IP, so we can exploit it however we want. If you want to do another game with it, maybe we'll say yes down the line. But we could also just take it to whoever we want. And now, especially again for smaller indie developers and whatever else, even like mid-range, like oftentimes you will retain your IP. So hey, they will do like right of first refusal. So if you want to make a follow-up to it, then they at least get to see the next pitch and try and make an offer on it if you're trying to shop it around, whatever else if they're not successful. But you know, unfortunately, there's not a lot of wiggle room on that stuff because at the end of the day, publishers are still putting a lot of risk on their books. You know, they're putting up the cash, and so they retain a lot of leverage in the contract.
does the right of first refusal also work like if, let's say, ARC has a right of first refusal and they want to put $10 million, but somebody else comes in and they want to put in $20 million. Does it have to bid the same amount as the other one, or they can?
Depends on the contract, but right, they could respond to certain things, but obviously, you know, if there's a better deal with more cash, then you can't go with that. Right of first refusal has some different stipulations depending, but oftentimes what it means is we get to see the pitch first, we get to make an offer first. You have to show it to us first so we can either pass on it or try and make an offer. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to take our offer either.
Was there any things in the contracts of your friends that you were like, oh, how did you guys not negotiate that and that got them in trouble?
Oh, all the time. I mean, again, I think the position that you end up in as a developer, especially a smaller developer, especially the smaller you are, is there's a couple of things. People aren't lawyers, and so reading these contracts aren't the easiest thing. You know, like I've been reading them for a long time, so I make sure and like go line by line with their lawyers, with the publisher themselves, and talk about what makes sense and what doesn't. But I also have the luxury to be able to do that because I understand these contracts. Our machine is a history that's good, so we can negotiate that type of stuff, or at least talk through certain things. But even then, it's like they will often say no to certain things or a lot of things because they still have most of the leverage. Like they are providing the cash at the end of the day, and so developers either don't know the language in there, don't read it carefully, don't want to push on things, even if they do know some of it, because they're afraid that they're going to pull the deal, which can happen for sure. Even if they put new terms forward, you know, the publishers, VC, whatever else, they might just say no to it. And like, you don't want to create conflict before you even get started on it, right? Because you're lucky to get a yes in the first place sometimes. So it's a weird position where, and especially now where, the contractions happen and money is a lot tighter than it used to be, there's an advantageous position to have that money and to say like, well, you got to follow our terms and that's kind of it, you know, and that's understandable to some extent, right? It's like we're putting the risk up in a lot of ways. Yes, you're doing the development, but we have certain protections we want. Obviously, there's been exploitation on that front that comes from different publishers that are like bad faith actors and just want to like squeeze the developer, but I think for the types of groups that we've worked with, the types of groups that want to like see projects through, their terms are much more reasonable typically, and they still want to talk about certain things with you.
Are the terms still like 50-50 or?
Depends on the budget, depends. I'm going to give those lawyer answers because it really does vary, but like, yeah, there's projects out there that'll, you know, publisher will get more than 50%.
Really?
Yeah, for sure.
Do they still ask to recoup all the money up front, or is like?
Yeah. Usually that's what happens. Like if they put money in, you know, $1 on profits goes to them until they recoup 100% at minimum. Oftentimes it's more than 100%. It's like, you know, 150 or sometimes double.
Do they recoup marketing spends as well? Do you have any?
Include that in budget oftentimes.
So that you see, because I've heard stories where they would be like, and marketing budget, but then you don't have any say in marketing budget. And they put all the marketing budget, including like, you know, paying like 100,000 for like a Comic-Con booth or whatever. And then you're like, wait, I didn't agree on that. We also didn't get any players from this, but you as a publisher got like exposure because your banner was there and we had a small little thingy on the bottom. So do you negotiate the max budget for recoup on marketing, or?
You can, and I definitely do that. But again, smaller developers or people without a track record or whatever else, almost impossible to negotiate that stuff. But yes, they can include marketing costs in the budget, and they can have like a, you know, the best I think you could do as somebody without much leverage is at least ask to stipulate an amount. So you're like, can I at least know how much you're allowed to spend on the budget? Maybe you can't dictate what they're like, where they're going to spend that marketing budget, but if there's like an additional 10% tacked on, because that's oftentimes what publishers do, they'll have their own, you know, like a safety net for budget surplus to make sure they cover whatever contingencies. And you can ask them at least to like, can you put a % down or a dollar amount down? Even if I can't say what you're like, when you're spending it and how you're spending it, I at least know. So it's a known quantity.
Was all like crazy stuff that happened in 23, 24, you still are coming up soon and have amazing announcements and a lot of hype around Hyperlight, Breaker, and Possessor. You know, the Drifter was in a game maker. You guys are working in Unreal, like it was 2D. You're working in 3D in Unreal. You're 2 years behind probably was the announcement. So like, what were the hardest things in this transition? Or what are the coolest things that you learned doing that?
And the hardest stuff is always just making the game itself, like day to day, and making sure it's really going to be fun, because the other aspect of like why games are particularly unique in creative fields is the interactive component of it. In linear media, you don't have to worry about any type of audience interference or, you know, divergence from your pure vision of something. Like I can make a movie exactly how I want to make it with all the money in the world, right? But a game, somebody might like turn right or turn left, and the thing that you want them to see, they might not see it in some way or another. And so that interactivity is such a wildly varied component of the experience that it's, again, it makes making video games the most challenging, like group creative endeavor, I feel like. And so no different here, where, you know, either Breaker or Possessors or whatever we're working on, it's just, is this going to be fun? Are people going to like this? How many different people do we have to like play test with to see and make a version that isn't just what we wanted to make, but also is received in a certain way? How are they judging how people perceive it, and what we can do to change how they perceive it on that interactive level just takes so much iteration.
Well, tell me what makes it fun. Like, tell me more about the game itself.
That's
like, there's
possible question to answer. Like, what makes it fun?
Yeah.
The game depends on people.
No, the Breaker. Like, what makes it fun for you? Like, why should I buy it? Like, why is this a unique product that nobody else is making?
We're creating a new subgenre, I would say, which is hard to do.
Okay.
You know, I can't describe it as it's just like this game. It's, you know, the best that I got is comparing it to a couple of genres or like other key games in some genres, rather than saying like, hey, it's like Dark Souls with this, or, you know, it's like Mario with this. Like, no, it's a
roguelike something.
It's
right?
something. It's like, you know, it's like, it's open world, you know, it's procedurally generated. It's got roguelike elements. It's run based. It's got extraction, you know, and it's its own kind of a thing, and that's really hard to roll up, and also really stupid to make in a lot of ways. Is like when you're trying to, you know, it's like being ambitious is silly in a lot of ways when you think about it. It's great. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but also understand how crazy it is.
Okay.
And how ridiculous it is when, you know, there are days where it's like, I could have just made a clone of this and been done with it already. I could have shipped this game out a year ago if I had done X, Y, and Z. But instead I decided like, nah, we got to do like these 6 things, 4 things, 2 things that are like super crazy and interesting, and because, you know, you just can't.
So why is this subgenre? Like, when you were having an idea of building it, you were like, fuck yeah, that's going to be really cool for my players.
When I think about making stuff, it's mostly like what I want to play personally.
I like being selfish. Yes.
I mean, it's selfish, but also I think that's true to like, I think anybody who I admire on the creative side of things, whether it's games or painting or whatever else it is, like what are they really interested in? Because if they're really interested in it, if they have a passion for it, then there's going to be some vision for it. There's going to be opinions about things that are really interesting. And that's why it's like I don't love a lot of Ubisoft stuff anymore, because it feels like it just kind of became diffuse. You know, it's just like a bunch of stuff that's video games, I guess. And I loved Far Cry 3, but now by Far Cry 6, I'm just like, it's kind of just the same stuff, but even more gray and ambiguous. You're not giving me hard opinions. You're softening all the edges. You're making everything kind of boring. And it's like the thing with Elden Ring, where people flock to From Software games because they have hard opinions about things. Maybe you don't like the menus. Maybe you don't like how hard those games are. But a lot of people would rather have that than like a Horizon Zero Dawn or whatever that came out at the same time, you know, which is like more AAA open world stuff that you've had in the same version for a long time. So again, having those, it's just different audiences or different expectations.
I haven't played it. So what about the subgenre that makes it so, like, makes you tickle?
Because I wanted to see, I love roguelikes and run-based stuff. I think there's a lot of really cool shit that you can do there still that people are, you know, still doing. And I wanted to see what we could do on that front with a bit of a different structure than what you're traditionally used to, because I also love really well designed and thoughtful open worlds or open designs in worlds, which is hard to do. You know, linear games great, more like narrow games are great, but I wanted to see, you know, what that traversal and that combat and kind of that exploration could do for a run-based, you know, more roguelike oriented game. So that's why we're making it. And there's a lot of good, like really excellent roguelikes out there that I can play forever and ever.
Right.
And I think one of the things that sort of broke the genre open a little bit was Risk of Rain 2. You know, that came out. It's like, hey, it's 3D. And
cannot confirm or deny we worked on that.
Yeah, it's more open, you know, it's not an open world, but it's a big level, and you're kind of just able to do things very different from like the room by room sort of roguelike that's 2D and fixed in these ways. So, you know, it's great that people want to expand that genre in some way or other, and so I wanted to do that too. Like, what else can we contribute to like the roguelike? Again, it's a weird genre term, but you know, it's more like roguelike elements and not strictly, who knows what that actually is. You can't really say, like, because if Risk of Rain 2 is a roguelike and Hades is a roguelike and also Spelunky is a roguelike or roguelite or whatever version of that you want to have, they're all very different games that share some DNA. And similarly for Breaker, it's like, yeah, no, we share a lot of that DNA, but also structurally there's compelling differences there that I would say isn't traditional in some of that genre, much like Risk of Rain 2 wasn't super traditional in the ways that they handled things.
Right.
So, I don't know, if you like roguelikes, then I hope you'll like this game.
I mean, Possessors and Breaker look very, very different. Like, and I know that you're the creative behind, or the creative mastermind, I don't know how you want to call yourself, behind all the games that you guys are building here. So, like, how do you compartmentalize it in your brain? How do you switch between?
Part of what helped for a project like this is making sure that we have certain people in place, you know, to be like a co-director on certain aspects, or to really carry through on production, or a lot of the team, since it's a smaller team than Breaker, it's I think 17 people now. A lot of good collaboration between them and setting them up to make sure to make good decisions on their own. So 17
people on Possessors, or?
Possessors.
Wow.
When I get to work with folks on Possessors, I'm always impressed by how kind they are and how willing they are to both, you know, give me ideas, but also to like listen when I explain what our limitations are. So that's something that makes it really easy to work with.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for donating your time and talking to our audience. I hope a lot of folks, especially that are starting their indie studios or being in the midst of this chaos that 2023 and 2024 and probably 2025 are going to bring to us, and just like, I don't know, I feel like the only thing I could say is just like, hold on.
That's kind of the thing, right? It's that cheesy thing that survived to 25 for a lot of folks. But also, yeah, hold on to anything you can. And Stuff will stabilize eventually in some way or another, but it'll just be different than it ever was. It's already different.
Play is such a critical aspect of my life, of a healthy lifestyle. It's one of the few indulgences I can sink into that requires the least effort of my body, but still engages my mind. Games allow me a modicum of control, the ability to travel and experience things I physically am not equipped for, and a reality with rules I can understand. It's why I love games and why I spend all my energy making them.